So yeah, my name is Cliff, and I'm going to tell you a couple of stories today that hopefully you find interesting, and we'll see how that goes. How many of you like to cook? There's a few hands, yes. Cool, I like to cook. And I heard a wonderful story not too long ago about a little girl who was cooking alongside her mom. And she said to her mom, she was noticing the mom cutting kind of this little piece off the side of the chicken, just as she put it into the roasting pan. I said, Mom, why do you do that? She says, well, actually, I don't know. I learned it that way from my mother. So next time they're visiting Grandma, they say, Grandma, what's the story with this chicken? Why do you cut this little piece off the end? Anyway, it carries on a few times. They eventually go and visit the grandmother. She also eventually says to them, so the grandmother doesn't know, but the great-grandmother says, well, it turns out that basically what had happened was when I bought my first oven, it was quite small. So I had a small roasting pan, and the chicken didn't fit. So the reason I've been cutting the chicken off was simply to make it fit. 2 generations later, we're still cutting a piece off the chicken for really not a lot of reason other than something that happened in the past. And I think that this is quite a nice metaphor for how we adopt a lot of things from other companies. That's not to say that it's bad to adopt, and I want to really emphasize that point. Or taking inspiration from other companies is really cool, but we need to make sure we're not just copying this chicken, yeah? That make sense? So, in short, we all have to start somewhere. For me, that was here. How many of you know where this is? Does anyone know where this is? There should be 1 or 2 South Africans in the room. There was one talking earlier, and there's one talking tomorrow, I think, as well. This is Cape Town. It's a wonderful city. If you ever have the opportunity to visit, it's really beautiful. This is where I grew up. Yeah. The point I want to tell you about is really how do we move beyond this idea of copy and pasting. You've all heard of Spotify. I spent a lot of time traveling and talking to people at conferences. Everybody's wanting to copy the Spotify model. And what I find interesting is that most often what people do is they start by renaming everything to chapters, guilds, squads, and tribes, as if names are going to change how you work. And I think really what you need to do is kind of get into some of the details. So I want to tell you a little bit of a story today about 3 lenses that I think can be helpful when you're trying to understand how to make this change. Cool? Awesome. So the 3 lenses that I like to look at: systems, science, and Sapiens. Now, partly it's nice because that's a bit of a marketing slogan. It all fits together. It's a nice package. But really, there's actually some really important lessons behind each of these. So I'll take you through them one at a time. So let's start with the system, right? You've all heard of systems thinking. Everybody knows about this in some way, shape, or form. But I have a question for you. What do you think about this? Who here can deliver entirely by themselves? Absolutely nobody. I met a wonderful woman, Amber van der Berg, and she has this lovely quote: if you can achieve your goals by yourself, you're not thinking big enough, which I quite like. The reality is that most of the time what happens is that we're actually working in a team environment, and one of the challenges that we face is that we're handing things off between multiple people or between different things, right? We do some work and we wait for the test environment or the feedback from the developer, feedback from somebody else, another department, that kind of thing. You've experienced this kind of situation? Yeah? How many of you work in a team that can deliver entirely by itself? 1 hand, 2 hands, 3 hands. Not a very high number. I think there's 150 odd people in the room, so 1.5%, 2%. Yeah. So one of the great promises of Agile is that we're supposed to be fast as an organization. We're supposed to be able to do everything really quickly, yeah? But part of the challenge is that our organization looks a little bit like this. This is a team that I worked with, and this is their stakeholder map, right? There was a team over here nobody knew about. 1 person was like, hey, by the way, we have a team called Unishark. They live in San Francisco. Have you heard of them? Oh, turns out we have some dependencies on their software and them on us, right? This is the reality that we have. So the challenge becomes, how do we organize around this and try to be fast when actually my piece of the step can be quite quick, But in order for the thing to be delivered end to end, I need to wait for several downstream teams. Same picture I showed you earlier. Imagine this now, that's a team instead of an individual, right? The top, you have the time that we actually work. The bottom, we have the time we wait between the next person starting or some pause. I did some work with a company a couple of years ago. When I arrived, they showed me a big wall, 400 cards. These are all the projects we're busy working on, they said. I asked them how many people. Can you guess how many? About the same as the number in this room. It was 100 people. My first question to them was, why do you want 75% of your work in a paused state at any given time? Yeah? There's no way that 100 people can work on 400 projects unless they have 4 laptops each. And even then, I'm not sure that it's possible, right? It's a little bit tricky. The other question for me is, why would we try to speed up the work when the waiting is what's causing the problem, right? If you look at a company, very often what you'll find is somewhere that this slide, the flow efficiency at the bottom, you can actually calculate this. If you say a project takes 9 to 12 months to be delivered, how much time did we actually spend working on it? 3 to 5% is pretty good in most companies. Now you might be thinking we're special, we're different. Maybe you are. I've yet to find a company that's above 10%. So why are we trying to speed up the working? We make the agile teams faster when the waiting between the teams is actually the problem. Yeah? Part of the problem, I think, is that we very rarely visualize end-to-end flow. We struggle to understand what the customer needs, and so it's very difficult to actually see how that value is created within the organization. So these slides are shamelessly borrowed from a good friend of mine, Klaus Leopold, and he talks about this model called flight levels. And I've been using this with a lot of the people that I've been working with. Essentially, if you think about it at this level, we have multiple teams around the company at an operational level who do some work, right? And what we want to try to do, basically, is think about it as multiple layers. You were talking about program level and strategy level, these kind of things, right? We have multiple teams who do things together, but we also need to coordinate between the teams. There's not so much value in me being done here if we wait 6 months for the next step, or it's 6 weeks in every other team's backlog before we can start the dependent piece in the chain, yeah? So we want to try to manage that flow. So what we do is we sit and we say, let's have a look at the teams, but most often what the teams are already doing is something like Scrum or Kanban, or it doesn't really matter what you're doing at the team level so much, because what we're interested in is the interactions between the teams. So if we consolidate all of this activity into a single coordination visualization, and just like you would do at a team level, you have a stand-up, you have retrospectives, you do planning, replenishment, whatever you're doing. Maybe you do it on a less frequent basis. You do it once a month or every couple of weeks or something instead of every day. Now you start to be able to understand and manage the end-to-end coordination across the company. Does this make sense? But there's another level. We have the strategy. Ultimately, a company or an organization is trying to achieve some kind of business outcome. We don't just launch in India as a product for no reason. We do it because we think there is some outcome to be achieved by doing this. Yeah? And usually, that cannot be visualized at the team level. It's also quite hard, actually, to visualize it at a coordination level, because you see projects and deliverables. We do some translation, localization, we deploy in the market, we do a bit of marketing, after-sales support, this kind of thing. But did we actually achieve the outcome? Yeah? That's ultimately the thing that we're talking about when we talk about this. So here is an example of a strategy level board. It's just a simple picture. As you can see, it doesn't look very different to what a team might be doing or what a program level might be doing. The difference is that the items that move through the board are a little bit different. They're just bigger. You track them in a slightly different way. And essentially, if you've built this in its entirety, you're looking at something that kind of has multiple feedback loops between different parts of the system. Sounds interesting, yeah? Cool. So essentially where this can help is if you're facing some challenges around end-to-end coordination, or maybe you're trying to understand how to translate strategy into delivery. Very often companies have quite clear goals around the strategy and quite clear goals at the team level, but the mid-layer, that coordination space, is just completely missing. So what we try to do is we fill it with the traditional methods of project management. Now I want to be clear, I have no issue with project management per se, but there is one limitation to taking a project view into the company, right? If my job is to make sure that you deliver this project, and your job is to make sure that they deliver a different project, how do we align this? How do we deal with that conflict and that friction between two ideas that consume the same capacity? We do something like this, we can see all the projects, all the strategic outcomes, all the tasks, all the deliverables, whatever we need to be able to see, and we can have good conversations about the full view. Yeah? So what happens if you can't include maybe your marketing or your infrastructure? You build something across a set of multiple teams. You say, right, we're doing this and this and this, but we don't have the upstream. We don't know where the sales ideas come from. We don't know what happens after we put it into the release pipeline. Like we say in most Agile methods, start where you are, right? If you can visualize something across multiple teams, that's already a good start. Now you start to see these two teams have a lot of dependencies. Maybe you have them sit near each other. Maybe you have them talk once a week, every day, however you need. Now you start to resolve some of those dependencies. Later you start to see, hey, we're always waiting on this other team over here. Can we visualize their work? Even if we can't get them engaged in our visualization, our board, our stand-ups, our meetings, and so on, simply tracking the things across the board can give us a bit of visibility. How many of you have only one thing to do this week? I need to find a better way to ask these questions, because when I ask a question like that, the obvious answer is no, right? For me, it's deliver this talk. That's this week. I had to get here as well, obviously, and eat some breakfast, but actual delivery, that's this, right? It's very rare that you have that scenario, though. We're always trying to do multiple things. Is it okay that that's gone off? Okay, cool. Of the things you have to deliver right now, which of those are the top priority for the company? Do you know the answer to that question? You know? One or two hands? Not so many, yeah? It's very hard to know in a complex organization which is the most important things. Ultimately, we often end up in this situation. Most companies die of indigestion, not of starvation. Yeah? Nokia didn't go out of business because they didn't have any more good ideas, right? It's a very, very rare scenario that you run out of ideas in a company. So what do you visualize? How about these? Do you have these things visualized in your organization? On the same board as the delivery work? Quite rare. It's one or two heads nodding. Probably you've seen some benefits from this as well, yeah? If I need to onboard somebody into my team, it consumes the same capacity that I would spend doing something else. And it's helpful to put that together. Now, I'm not saying you need to write a post-it note for every time you want to have lunch or take a pee. There's obviously some limitation to what we want to visualize, but when we need to make a prioritization decision between them, probably it's helpful to visualize. Here's an example. This is actually from one of the teams at Spotify. And what you can see here is you've got the product and operations improvement, you've got release blocking issues, recruitment, and we called it tribe improvement. So activities to improve morale or to plan an offsite or technical improvements, everything like that. All in one place, daily stand up around this. Everybody knows what the leaders are up to, the managers know what they should be doing. Everybody can, see how their work fits together. Quite powerful. Have any of you ever worked in a fire department? You been to a fire department? There's one hand at the back. Someone's been to the fire department or worked in a fire department. Have you used their services before? You had to phone them for get a cat out the tree or something, hopefully not your house on fire. If you phoned the fire department and you said, hey, my house is on fire, can you please come and put out the fire? And they said, well, we have an opening next week, Thursday. How is this for you? Not so good, right? Why is that? High cost of delay. Yeah?
Because the house is burning and we need immediate action.
We need immediate action. Yeah? If there's a delay here, your house will burn down, right? Now, I'm not trying to suggest that the work in your company will actually result in somebody's house being burned down, but the scenario here is that the way the fire department achieves this kind of efficiency and responsiveness is by standing around doing nothing. Maybe they pose for calendars or they're gymming or something. I don't know what firemen do when they're not putting out fires. But they're doing something other than putting out fires. They're waiting to be ready because the impact of not being able to do the thing that they're there for is very high. There are teams inside your company that are like the fire department, right? If every team has a 6-month-long backlog, you're the opposite of a fire department at scale. Yeah? So what do we want to do? We want to try to create focus. Now, this is a word we throw around. It's very easy to say we want focus. I heard a fantastic presentation not too long ago. Someone was saying, we really need to focus, focus, focus. Here are the 17 OKRs for the next quarter. Not so much focus, yeah? 17 things does not create focus. What we want to try to communicate here is what order and what is the most important. Sequence them. Don't do anything on number 17 until 1 is finished. If you absolutely cannot help out on number 1, maybe working on 17 is fine. To simplify it, don't let number 3 block number 1. You could extend that to any number that's not 1. Yeah? One of the ways I like to do this is if you're using the strategy level board that I showed earlier, 10 things that are important to the company, or the 17 that are there. Here are the ones that are in progress. Here are the ones we're going to do later. Here are the ones we're not doing right now. And in order. I ask for your help on something. I'm sorry, I can't help you. I'm working on number 1 right now, but come back in a couple of weeks. Yeah? You give people the information to be able to make that decision. If you're interested to learn more about this aspect of systems, here are 3 books that I really like. My slides will be available if you'd like to have a copy, but feel free to take a photo as well. The first one, this is kind of the introduction of flight levels as a concept, the book Rethinking Agile by Klaus Leopold. Hopefully many of you know about Don Reinertsen as well. Principles of Product Development Flow, talking about how do you actually optimize economically and understand the metrics behind flow, as well as how do you do it systemically with boards and visualization and so on. And thinking in systems. Far more generalized than necessarily the type of systems we work with, but often it's helpful to have that kind of ideas. Cool. So, to summarize for systems, think end to end, try to create focus. With me so far? Cool. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit now because I want to try to have some time for questions. I'd like to hear what you're thinking about this. So I think I'm at 26 minutes or so. We'll see how that goes. Cool. So the second of the 3, systems, science, and sapiens. This one is about science, or what we normally do, which is guessing. Yeah? Very often we end up in this situation. We end up building something. I don't know if you can see that, sorry. It's a little bit blurry. The font is quite small. Basically, now that we've developed the side effects, let's go for the cure, right? Very often we do this. We build all of the things that we need, or we start at the wrong end. You had a slide earlier that was showing about the number of features that get used. My experience is that often 20% is even quite optimistic. I think Adobe did a study that was 1% of their features that they'd built for their products had been used by their customers. 1%, right? So the question for me is not how do we be more productive, how do we be more effective with what we produce? Yeah? Probably some more productivity will have an impact, but if we cannot tell which ones work, faster is not better. I've heard it said, neater, faster crap is not helpful. Yeah? This kind of thing. So how do we do this? We want to be able to start with a hypothesis, right? This fancy word for basically saying, what are your assumptions and how do you understand this? What is the current state of understanding so that you can validate later? If I ask this question, forecast 90% chance of rain, and it's not raining today. Maybe that's rare in Kathmandu, but 90% chance of rain is not raining. Am I wrong? Who thinks I'm wrong? Who thinks I'm right? Who didn't understand the question? So the key here is that we actually have a probability, right? It's not a guarantee. 90% is not it will rain. It means if I forecast 100 times, 90 of those times it will be raining. So without some sample set of data, it's not possible for me to tell if this is accurate. A single data point does not prove a probability. Yeah? Maybe we don't need 100 samples, but 100 would be helpful, but 10, you know? It didn't rain one day, it rained 9. Cool, pretty good weatherman. Yeah? We need to quantify the assumption. My assumption, it will rain, and the probability, 90%. Without this probability, it's very, very hard to actually understand after we've done something if it was helpful or not. How do you tell? How many of you are consistently checking what happens after you deliver? 3 hands and 2 hearts. Sort of sometimes maybe check. Yeah? You cannot update your initial assumptions and make better decisions in the future if you're not looking at what you did in the past. Yeah? One of my favorite books of last year, any of you heard of Annie Duke? She won the World Series of Poker a couple of times. She's a world famous poker player. Fantastic book, Thinking in Bets. And she talks about a number of great ideas and tells it in really nice stories. Basically, she talks about this concept of resulting, where we evaluate, so I try something, and I evaluate whether or not it was a good decision based on whether I got the outcome I wanted or not, right? However, in poker, you know the probability, you know the odds, right? 90% chance of rain. If I predict that and it rains 10% of the time, I'm not so good. But if it's raining, it doesn't mean that I'm good or successful. We need to separate these two things. The outcome and the decision data that was input at the beginning are not the same thing. We need to be careful of avoiding this. And how do we do that? A healthy dose of feedback loops every morning, breakfast, lunch, and dinner maybe, yeah? This is one of my favorite slides, secretly, but now I've told you, so not a secret anymore. Yeah, we want to have feedback loops. If we don't seek feedback, if we don't check what happened, we won't learn, yeah? It's much easier to learn if we know what we were expecting or we have some hypothesis to test against. So, to quote Don Reinertsen again, he says, decentralizing decision-making, right, requires not only giving people the authority or responsibility to make decisions, but the information to do so as well, yeah? The 3 boards that I showed you, the 3 levels, we want to give people the information to understand what is important. Let's not tell them that this is the most important project, but help them to see what would be the impact of doing this thing over that thing. Put the data there, put your assumptions. If we launch in India, we will make 10 million. If we launch in South Africa, where I'm from, we'll make 1 million. Okay, we start, turns out we're a little bit wrong, we adjust the pace, we reallocate our capacity or our efforts towards the other one, based on what we learned. Something takes longer or it goes slower, something should change. It blows my mind how often we work with agile organizations and people saying it's all about adapting to change. We plan in 6-week cycles at the team level, and we don't adapt after each sprint. No stories get thrown away. No new ones get created except for something new that the product manager dreamed up. It's not based on data. We launch market after market after market with no new insight about why we should pick this one over the other one. Ultimately, what we want to try to do is create a cadence of feedback loops, right? Cadence is a fancy way of saying rhythm, right? How often do you need to have these conversations? Allocate some time. A lot of companies work on a quarterly or a half-yearly cycle, that kind of a thing. But you need to be able to separate the different activities and plan for them. It's very hard to switch between super tactical and very strategic in the same context, the same meeting. Separate these out. Planning, doing, reviewing. How do we separate this out? A format that I like is we use this at a number of teams. So the frequency that you would do it would be different. But if you think about the operational, the coordination, the strategy level, simple kind of catch-ball sort of exercise, if you will. What have we achieved or learned since last time? What's new? What are the outcomes? What have we planned to do next? What's on our minds? What are we thinking about, right? Now, this is very key for leaders because we're not trying to say it's on my mind, therefore it must be on yours. I think about things in my context. You don't necessarily have to think about all the details. What am I stressed by? So I might be stressing about something. And what do I need your help with? Or what do I need help with? And separating these things out is really quite powerful. Do this at multiple levels in the company, departmental, team, multi-team, the entire company. What is the state of things? Really, really powerful. Ultimately, what we want to be able to do with this is shut down unproductive paths quickly. So like we said, we find out that the 1% of the features are the ones that are being reused, these ones are not. User testing says everybody thinks this is super weird or confusing. Employees are saying that this is very complicated, it doesn't make any sense, something like that. We want to look for things that are unproductive and shut them down as quickly as possible. So, if you'd like to read more about science, 3 books that I can recommend reading. I mentioned Annie Duke, Thinking in Bets already. We have Escaping the Build Trap by Melissa Perry. If you're a product manager or you work with product management, this book is fantastic. And 4 Disciplines of Execution. How to build a cadence of feedback loops is one of the key points in this book. Cool. Ready to move on? So, just to summarize this, we said, if you want to be better at being scientific, you need to have a hypothesis before you start, some explanation of what you think will happen, and a cadence of feedback loops so that you can check in and see how things are going. Cool? So, it's all about the Sapiens at the end of the day. All these ideas are nice and grand, but we need humans to be able to do these things, right? How many of you work in a company with humans? I'm wondering what the rest of you do. Maybe AI or something, yeah? I had a previous person I used to work with, and they always used to say, our goal is to automate the entire company, and the last person to leave will just switch out the lights as they go home. One day this might actually be true, but how many of you heard this thing, but people resist change? Have you heard this saying? How many of you believe that saying? You think people resist change? Or, people won't work if we don't tell them what to do. Have you heard this one? For me, these are quite similar, and I think couched in some sort of, or related to a similar way of thinking. I like this. If you have dead wood inside your company, it really only got there one of 2 ways. Either you hired dead wood, or you hired live wood and you killed it. Yeah? Stop doing those 2 things. I think part of the reason why we have this problem is that we tend to think of leadership through a metaphor of chess or systems, right? It's strategy and beating the other person, or it's machine models. You know, one part is interreplaceable. If the gearbox breaks, we put in a new one and it's fixed. Humans are not like that. It's much more like this. Growing and nurturing, like planting. You cannot tell a plant to grow. I mean, you can, but it probably doesn't work so well, yeah? You'll be disappointed with the results. What you do is you create the conditions that are necessary for a plant to grow. Yeah? If a plant likes sunlight, put it in the light. If it doesn't like light, take it out the light. If you muddle these 2 up, can you shout at the plant? Probably not effectively, yeah? So the question I like to ask in this space is, are we safe to fail? And a couple of the other speakers have mentioned this concept of, are we safe to fail? Very often it looks more like this. It's sort of, I was told you not to fail, why did you fail, right? Doesn't tell me what to do instead. Doesn't help me, doesn't create the conditions that are necessary for my survival and for my safety. If you feel like that kid on the right, feel like this kid when you're meeting a leader or your manager, you have some work to do. If this is how your performance review feels, you have some more work to do. So I want to give you a couple of examples of things that I think are quite cool ways. So this is actually from Spotify. It was one of the company's values. And it originally says, think it, build it, ship it, tweak it. But some people who think they're hilarious decided to change it to twerk it, because why not? Somehow twerking is funnier than tweaking, apparently. But it would get taken down by the cleaning staff every now and again, and a couple of minutes later it was back. You're allowed to have fun. You're allowed to be yourself. You're allowed to bring your whole self to the work environment. One thing I like, have any of you heard of the power of yet? If you know of a woman by the name of Carol Dweck, the growth mindset, she talks about this. Right? I can't do this yet. Powerful change in one single word, right? And illustrates quite nicely the difference between fixed and growth mindset. Yeah? This doesn't work yet. I don't know this yet. I can't do that yet. I haven't been successful yet. It opens the possibility that we could be successful in the future and turns on a part of our brain that makes us seek that out instead of thinking that we are incapable. And if you think you're incapable, you will be. If you think you're capable, you will be. The mind is a powerful thing. I'll summarize the book at the end, but becoming is better than being, is the idea. We all talk about this, we want to pursue perfection. We know that this is not possible to achieve. It doesn't stop us from trying, right? So what about if a market launch feels like this? Or maybe some other part of your company, you're doing a restructure. Have you had this scenario? You ever felt like the little kid on the right? You know a restructure is coming because somebody told you something by the water cooler. You're not sure if your job is going to be safe, or maybe not so catastrophic, but are you going to have the same manager? Are you going to work with the same people that you spent the last 6 years getting to know? Do you have to learn some new technology? Something like this. Now, I'm not trying to say that we should avoid any kind of change, because change can be uncomfortable. But if it feels like this, your job as a leader is to change that. Make it feel less intimidating. So how do we do this? Some of the things that we can do is to use tripwires, right? If this thing happened, or I see this kind of thing emerging, that for me is an emergency thing, or, oh, I should actually stop that. The other part is to have what I call safety nets, in the sense of, if you think about in a deployment scenario on a technology side, there's a story that I like. One of the teams that I was working with, one of the engineers was quite new, and in the first few days on the job, managed to cause quite a massive incident at the company. And I noticed this because I was sitting there and suddenly it was, when it's, how many of you have kids? You know that sound when it's just too quiet? Like, things were happening and then it's just too quiet, something's not right. Sort of this deafening silence from over here. I turn around and this poor dude has gone more pale than usual, and he's looking at me and I said, what's wrong? He said, I think I just killed Spotify. Turned out it wasn't that bad. It was only 10% of Europe, so not that big a deal. But basically what happened next was what was powerful. A bunch of people jumped on Slack and started saying, firstly, don't stress about this. On my first day, I killed this and I did that and I've killed that and I did some other thing, and embracing the fact that there was a failure. But we don't want to just embrace failure, we want to embrace and encourage learning. So next we jump into, what do we do about this? What do we learn from this situation, right? It shouldn't really be possible to deploy something on Puppet across the entire infrastructure in one step. Staged rollouts, something like this, right? We have ways, safety net, we try it on 1%, then we roll it to 10. We try it with some people, and we see how the others respond. We try it in one market, we see how the other, yeah? Safety nets like this, super, super powerful. If you have the feedback loops from before, you're already a few steps ahead. So as I said, we want to create safety to fail, not so that we can fail fast, but so that we can learn fast. We have to be able to fail in order to learn. We also need to be able to succeed, but ultimately we want to celebrate the learning. How many of you would say that you're biased? It's a very small number of hands. That's getting a bit better. How many of you are biased? I'll put my hand up because I put 2 hands up, in fact. Newsflash, we're all biased, right? And I'll show you. Any idea what's happening here? It's a lot of men making decisions about women's rights. This is Donald Trump's Council on Women's Rights. Is there any possibility that they make a good decision? I mean, aside from what you think about the specific people, they're making decisions about people who are not in the room, right? There is so much bias in this scenario. It's like, it just blew my mind when I saw this. I was like, what the hell? How many of you know what's happening here? I'm getting a few of the right answers. I think I'm also speaking to the right audience as well. Now, normally when I do this talk, the first answer I get, or even the answer I get at all, is not the correct one. People say, oh, it's a wedding, somebody came home from a family thing, they're meeting at a station, something like this. Because people make assumptions about what Indian women are doing, right? Their mental models are not that these are scientists who just launched a mission to Mars and they're celebrating it, yeah? That's bias. That doesn't mean you're a bad human and something negative is going to happen, but you need to be aware that we all do this, right? You think differently about people based on their accent, the color of their skin, the gender, how they dress, these kind of things, yeah? And that's okay, because there's a good reason why we have this, right? Many years ago, well, I mean, they're still dangerous, but many years ago, if this jumped out from the bush and tried to attack you, you didn't want to be thinking, it's kind of a yellow color and it's moving fairly fast. I think it's coming towards me and it looks a little bit hungry. By that stage, you're lunch, yeah? You want to snap assess, this is danger, and you want to run the hell away, yeah? Just, it doesn't make sense to stick around. The reality is that we have 2 common modes of thinking. It's much broader than that. But we make snap assessments based on patterns of things we've seen before or things we've been taught, and we can do deep thinking. I want to talk to you a little bit about the deep thinking side. So part of what I'm getting at with this is actually around diversity and inclusion. Have you all heard of this concept before? Some of you have heard of it? So for me, I like this metaphor. I picked this up from a fellow speaker. Diversity is being, let me read this correctly, diversity is being invited to the party, but inclusion is getting to choose the music. Yeah? It's quite different to say we want representation in the room to having people actively participating and feeling welcome in that space, right? And as leaders, it's our responsibility to make that true. Otherwise, people feel like the sumo wrestler. Well, the kid, not the sumo wrestler. The one to be, soon to be future sumo wrestler. Yeah? So what can we do about this? We want to try to intentionally design around our biases. So we know we're biased. Probably we don't want to change the way we run away from the lion. But if you have a problem with hiring women into engineering roles, there are probably some things you can do. Have any of you tried this? Anonymous CV screening. There's a story from, I think it was the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. They noticed that the hiring was very strongly biased for almost all instruments towards men. It's not that there weren't women out there who played instruments, but those were the ones that were getting hired. It's not possible, we're not biased, we just pick the best candidates, they said. So they said, cool, fine, we'll run a test. What we'll do is we'll get people to play behind a curtain. You can't see who they are, you can't see their nationality, anything about them. What do you think happened? It moved, but slightly, ever so slightly. And they couldn't understand why, because they were convinced that this was not correct. What they found out is that most musicians or people, when they go to an interview, they dress up. And for women, that often meant wearing heels. Hearing the heels walking out onto the stage was enough to bias the results. They put down a carpet, they hire 50-50. Hearing the heels was enough to tell you that it was a woman and therefore bias you against their music. Scary, huh? Put down the carpet, put down the screen. These kinds of things are things that you can do. Removing where people studied, removing their name, removing their country of origin will reduce any bias. Try it out, see if it makes a difference. Worst case scenario, you haven't lost anything. Yeah? Another simple example. How many of you would say, 3 minutes, yeah? Cool. Didn't get quite enough time for the questions, but we'll see. Maybe we can cut 2 minutes into lunch and take a question or two. How many of you send out pre-reading or notes before your meetings? Anybody do this? Show of hands, how many of you are very good at making quick decisions, like super snap, you like fast decision making? And how many of you prefer more to kind of think about it and consider all the options, go deep? Yeah? Quite a lot more of you. Neither of those ways is right. They're just right for you, right? There are times when we want the snap decision, and there are times when we need to think through all of the consequences. Pre-reading will give you the option to consider the consequences beforehand. Having some notes afterwards, because there are people who are maybe not in the room. These kinds of things can be helpful. So, if you'd like to learn more about this, 3 books that I can recommend. Humble Inquiry by Edgar Schein. Most of his books are fantastic. I highly recommend reading the rest of them. He does have a lot, but it's very, very good. I mentioned Mindset by Carol Dweck, and if you're specifically interested in culture, especially if you work in HR, I cannot recommend Powerful enough. Fantastic book. So, to summarize, we said we want to create safety to fail, and we want to focus on diversity and inclusion by allowing people not only to be present, but also letting them choose the music, right? So, we've talked about 3 lenses, system science and Sapiens. I want to just quickly summarize the entire talk. I'm not going to walk you through it in too much detail, but basically systems is about understanding the interactions between the teams and how that can create true agility. Science is about understanding what actually works and what doesn't so that we can shut down unproductive paths as quickly as possible. And Sapiens is mostly about creating powerful, diverse sets of humans who can deliver amazing results. Thank you very much, and I'd love to hear your questions and thoughts.